Hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Speers, host of Insiders, filling in for Hamish McDonald, who is hoping to be out of lockdown and back with you soon. Great to be with you live from Melbourne. And joining me on the panel tonight, journalist and filmmaker Santilla Chingaipe, Liberal member for Higgins, Katie Allen, who is a paediatrician and public health researcher before entering politics. World-renowned philosopher Peter Singer, the associate editor of The Australian, Cameron Stewart, who's just returned home from the United States. And in Darwin, Labor Senator for the Northern Territory, Malarndirri McCarthy. Please make them all feel welcome.
The New South Wales government says they are following the best health advice. Yet every day we are seeing high case numbers and cases that have been in the community while infectious. Would it not have been more effective to have locked down Sydney earlier? Even now, large retail chains remain open when they have online presence and delivery capability. This gives an avenue for people to move around, thereby curtailing any large reduction in community cases. Shouldn't further restrictions be introduced now for this last week of lockdown?
Katie Allen, let me go to you first on this. You've lived through tougher lockdowns in Melbourne, obviously. Do you think New South Wales, the Premier Gladys Berejiklian, should have gone earlier and harder with this lockdown?
Look, I think, David, Karen's question is one that faces, everybody around the globe, and you need to look at the decisions and the balance that a government is making. And, I really back in Gladys's decision-making to this point. She would have been making that decision with her cabinet apprised of the fact that they've got a crack COVID contact tracing team, but they've also got shifting sands if you look at the Delta variant, and you also look at the compliance in the community. I think things are changing, and so you could say we could have done this, but they're balancing lives and livelihoods, and that's a difficult balance to make. And I think if it was for free, if you didn't have the emotional and economic consequences of a lockdown, I'm sure they probably would have locked down earlier, but you have to balance those many difficult things in the one decision making, and that risk balance ratio is why we look to our governments to make those decisions. They're not easy.
No, they're not easy decisions, but with 38 cases recorded yesterday, 11 of them were in the community while they were infectious. There are still, no restrictions on how far people can travel across Sydney. Shops like florists and designer handbag stores are still open. I mean, do you think this is really gold standard when it comes to this Delta variant?
Well, I actually think that we are seeing around the world a change in the risk balance ratio. And, I know that we have a little way to go with regards to the vaccination uptake. But what I would say is we are seeing high rates of vaccination in our most vulnerable population. And I've always argued that the target should be around preventing deaths, because we know that the vaccine is most effective in preventing deaths. It's not actually as effective in preventing cases, and we don't really know whether it's good at preventing infections. So we really want to make sure we don't have deaths from COVID, and so we are getting high rates. More than 70% of the over 70-year-olds are now vaccinated. That is where the deaths occur. So that's where I think we're seeing a change in the balance in the equation, and we're seeing countries like Singapore making different decisions, and I think Australia needs to have that conversation.
And I think we're going to come to the vaccination debate, but Cameron, let me come to you, because you've just come back from the United States. It's a very different approach to COVID in Australia. And each lockdown, we do see, an inevitable debate about whether it should have happened sooner, later, harder, weaker. What have you made of how New South Wales and Gladys Berejiklian in particular is handling this outbreak?
Look, I think New South Wales has generally tended to be more reluctant to lock down quickly than the other states, and I've always thought that that's a better approach. Where this goes from here, who really knows? But it's certainly been, there's certainly a vastly different approach to this whole pandemic in the United States, and the experience of the US versus Australia, where I've spent the last 4 years in the US. And really, over there, they got it all wrong last year. They absolutely mucked it up from the White House downwards, and Australia got it right. I remember being in Washington, feeling quite proud and envious of Australia's ability to to do much better than the rest of the world in relation to the pandemic last year. But now it seems that the tables have almost completely turned. In the US, the US is almost awash with vaccines. Most people in America over the age of 12 who wants a vaccine can have it. The country is free. It's flying around. There's no lockdowns. They can even go to Europe. Britain in a week's time will unhatch the country as well. Here in Australia, our largest city is locked down. Our second largest city, Melbourne, was locked down a few weeks ago. Brisbane locked down as well. And so really, the contrast is very vast, and with the vaccines...
But just on that, I mean, people aren't dying in Australia.
No,
certainly,
that's right.
Compared to those countries you mentioned, the US and the UK, sure, they may be opening up. They've still got plenty of COVID.
And plenty of deaths.
And plenty of deaths.
No, there's not that many deaths compared to what there was, but still proportionally, it's much, much better over there. The freedom is coming. I'm not saying that should be the case now. I think that Sydney has to lock down under the circumstances, but it's very frustrating that Australia is so far behind the eight ball with timing on this stuff.
Peter, I mean, you've witnessed these lockdowns since the pandemic began, and certainly here in Melbourne, we went through a very long one last year. They have been debated each time. Do you think it is becoming clearer whether lockdowns and how they're applied, the rights and wrongs, going early, going hard, is that becoming more straightforward as to what should be done by premiers?
I think it is clearer, and I think it's clear that the Victorian lockdowns, which were much tougher and went earlier, and the recent one went early but was fairly short, have worked better than what the New South Wales government has been doing, where I think they have been too soft and too slow, and now they're getting the consequences of it. And I think you can't really make the comparison with the United States or the UK, because we have a chance of eliminating the virus. As we, in Victoria, we haven't had any local cases of transmission for the last 8 days. Whereas, there's no chance in Europe or the United States that they are going to eliminate the virus. They have to get out of it through vaccination. I agree that we've done quite badly in terms of vaccination, and we are lagging far behind. But still, we're better off in having very few, or in some cases zero cases, and we can achieve that with these tough short lockdowns and with better quarantine, which is the other thing we've stuffed up. If we had more remote quarantine stations, we wouldn't have the same high risk of the leakages that we're having into the larger community.
Just on the point you raised there about pursuing zero cases, it still seems a little fuzzy in New South Wales as to whether that's what is being pursued here, zero community transmission. I know this was asked a number of times of the Premier today. Is it clear now that's what we should be pursuing? Katie Allen, just back to you on that.
Look, I think there has been, in Victoria, this concept, I think, unsaid concept about going for, complete elimination. And I think that the Premier never quite said that, but some of his public health servants did. He wasn't straight with the community about that. So I think there was a dissonance between what National Cabinet, with all the Premiers and territory leaders and the Prime Minister, were saying inside that room, and then coming out and we're getting a dissonance with regards to that. And I think that it's actually naive to think that we would eliminate COVID. I think that's actually a very public health naive approach, and that is not the conversation that the National Cabinet has had with the Australian public, and I think it's actually unfair when
but it has been the case in different states for quite long periods of time.
We still continue to have people returning home from overseas.
Exactly. That's right. And if we had better
and what you're
quarantine,
suggesting is unconstitutional. You're saying citizens
I
should
agree
not
with
be
Peter.
allowed to return to Australia? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying they should return to Australia, but we should have, like Howard Springs, which, as I understand it, hasn't leaked.
Absolutely.
We should have. Thank you. Yeah, you would know much more about that, of course,
Absolutely.
Senator.
I agree with you, Peter. Absolutely.
Senator, I'll come to you in just a moment. I just want to be clear about this point. Many of the states have effectively pursued zero COVID.
Community outbreaks, which is very different.
You still get outbreaks, but they try to squash them and get down to zero in the community.
I've always said from the very get-go that quarantining is a human interface. And I've been on the board of a local hospital, and every human interface has accidents. Just a fact of life. 350,000 people coming through quarantine facilities, 3,500 of those being COVID positive, and knowing that the incubation period for COVID is longer than 14 days in 1 in 100 cases, it's naive to think it's not going to leak. And the Howard Springs quarantining facilities had rapid antigen testing. That is what is distinctly different from the other forms of quarantining. So there are many things that we can continue to improve with regards to quarantining, and we should.
Yeah, and I think we've got a few separate issues.
But we've always got to have
here.
many layers of protection. It's not one thing that's going to have sorted this out.
There's a few issues in the mix here, and quarantine's one of them. But when there is an outbreak, like we have in Sydney at the moment, should a lockdown persist until there is zero community transmission?
Well, actually, when the last lockdown occurred in Melbourne, the messaging that came from the state government was, we will lock down until we get control of contact tracing. That's what they said. Until we get control of contact tracing. Now,
so
they are in charge of knowing what their numbers are. They are in charge of knowing how much their crack teams are going out there and actually getting control of it. And they also understand the community consent to doing that as well. And that is changing as we speak, as is the expectations of what can be achieved and what is achieved.
Senator, is it clear to you whether pursuing zero community transmission is or should be the goal?
David, what's clear to me is that here in the Northern Territory, we were the first to lock down immediately at the beginning of the pandemic because we were conscious of the vulnerabilities here in the Territory. And only last week, we immediately locked down with the Tanami gold mine outbreak. So clearly, and locking down is important if we want to eliminate the issue at hand straight away. And we've shown that. And we've also shown that in terms of the quarantine facility that we have here. Why hasn't the federal government rolled out a similar style Howard Springs quarantine facility in the capital cities across Australia?
Well, it's a question that's constantly raised, and well, I don't know if Katie Allen, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I do actually. And are you asking that we stand down the hotel quarantining system as well?
Well, the hotel quarantine system is clearly not working, is it?
I haven't heard
Katie?
one politician suggest that we close them down. Are you suggesting we close down hotel quarantining tomorrow?
Well, those hotel quarantine systems
when we have
are
more
for tourists.
ones,
We'll just let the Senator respond to that. Sorry, Senator McCarthy.
So what I'm saying, Katie, is that the coalition government in 2007 was able to, and I use this as an example logistically, was able to roll out over 200 demountables right across the Northern Territory in remote regions of the Northern Territory under the Northern Territory intervention. And yet it is very incapable of rolling out across the capital cities, which are not in rural and remote areas of Australia, a quarantine system very similar to the Howard Springs facility. There is no urgency to this government in wanting to ensure that we have the most appropriate quarantine facilities for all Australians and for those Australians who want to come back from overseas.
Ever since Julia Banks first heard her story about being bullied, I have wanted her to name names, so the constituents of these bullies' electorates can know who they're voting for. I even asked her personally on Q&A once to do this, as I really strongly believe they should be held accountable. In Ms Banks' recent interview on 7:30, in my opinion, she implied that she wasn't going to name names because she believes there is no accountability in the government and is scared of the repercussions. Her story is sadly another item in an ever-growing list of serious scandals where no minister has been seriously investigated or held accountable. Why is there no justice for victims? Just, it seems, men behaving badly.
Well, Katie Allen, this is the allegation that the former Liberal MP, Julia Banks, has made, that she was touched inappropriately by a Cabinet Minister. She's not naming that Cabinet Minister. Firstly, do you believe Julia Banks?
Oh, look, I think that absolutely. I think that Julia is, a political warrior, and I think she's a strong woman. And it is interesting, in a normal workplace, what you would do is you'd speak to your supervisor and they'd speak to their supervisor, and there'd be a process, or there'd be an independent process that would be private and confidential. And both of those things clearly were missing. It's a bit surprising that Julia respected Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister at the time and she didn't speak to him. So that is disappointing, but, good on her for speaking up now. And it's something that we need to draw a line in the sand, and we need to put people on notice that that sort of behaviour in any workplace, whether it's Parliament or right across Australia, is unacceptable, and it's just not on. Can
you understand, though, someone in that situation, or I suppose any woman, not immediately raising a complaint? These things often take some time.
Actually, I sat at a dinner table once, and the hostess was, basically the guy sitting next to her was an old friend, put his hand around and, grabbed her. And I was shocked because she didn't say anything. And then afterwards we were cleaning up and she burst into tears. And I thought, oh, she's obviously well behaved. I would have just, told him off then and there. But we were all shocked by that behaviour. So I think clearly what happens when these things happen, people are so taken aback and it's so shocking they just don't know what to do. So I do understand her response at the time. Yeah. But I think we need to call out this behaviour, and I think, people need to understand those things are just not okay.
They're not. This is still a Cabinet Minister in your government. Would you like to know who it is?
Well, this all happened before I was in Parliament, and I don't want to go backwards because I want to fix COVID. I want to fix climate change. I want to get on with.
I appreciate that.
As a woman, always having to talk about the women's issue, I want to be talking about the issues that are important, which include cultural issues.
But the question is about a cabinet minister who is still in cabinet. Surely you'd want to know who that is if they're behaving like this.
Well, I think the thing about an independent process is it will allow, in a workplace environment, for the people in that workplace to have complaints made against them, and we will be able to see those sorts of behaviours if they are accumulating, not just perhaps a once-off, that if there's an accumulation of experiences, we will know that, and that is going to change the culture. Even just having these processes in place is going to change, and has already changed.
The process won't
deal with this. To be honest, that has already changed.
Simon Birmingham, the Finance Minister, has said this case won't go before that new independent body that's being established.
Well, I think the thing is that the independent body could keep going backwards, and I think we need to make sure that we're going forward. So we want to stop this behaviour. We want this behaviour because people want to see their leaders reflect themselves in their leaders, but their leaders are held to a higher account.
Santilla, let me ask you, do you think Julia Banks should be naming this cabinet minister if she's going to raise this issue, raise this allegation?
I mean, it depends on the legal risks that come with making these sorts of allegations, and I think this is what a lot of women have to consider when thinking about coming forward. I think what I'm curious about is the fact that there's still not a lot of accountability when it comes to these sorts of issues. I mean, Julia Banks is one of a long line of women that have come forward talking about the culture within federal politics and the fact that women still feel unsafe going into work and that these things are still happening. And the fact that that incident happened so brazenly, I mean, it didn't surprise me, but at the same time I was like, gosh, this is still happening. And I'd be curious to sort of wonder, like, at what point do we start to see change? Because, I mean, Katie talked about, regardless of whether this is happening in Canberra or the rest of the country, it is unacceptable, absolutely, but people model their behaviour from their leaders, right? And if people aren't being held accountable, how do you expect everyone else in the community to conduct themselves a certain way? And I think that accountability is a first step in this, but also ensuring that, there are a lot of young women that are interested in entering politics, certainly some that might be watching you tonight, and hearing these sorts of accounts might stop people from thinking about pursuing a career in politics.
I stood up in the party room and said the very first thing, the day after Brittany Higgins, we need to professionalise this place, and I need to see procedures and processes around that are going to support that process. And the Kate Jenkins review is welcomed, and so is the Stephanie Foster review, and those processes are being put in place as we speak. And I'd like to say I've contributed to that, and that is true. We want the young women of Australia to look and say, we want to be in the heart of democratic decision-making. We want women and men to feel safe in that workplace, and we want to be proud of our leaders. I completely agree with you, Santilla.
Malarndirri, McCarthy, let me ask you about this because, I mean, Kieran's question goes to that issue of accountability. When's someone going to be held accountable for something like this? I mean, Julia Banks did say, she's not fearless as to why she hasn't named a name here. There are always consequences, she said, in these circumstances. Can you understand her position?
Well, I think it's reflective of many women who have experienced some kind of harassment or worse, assault, alleged rape. You wonder whether you come forward. You only have to look at the statistics across the country, David, for alleged victims who very rarely do get a conclusion that is satisfactory and just in those outcomes. So my concern here, I guess, more deeply, is that when nothing happens, it reinforces the view that your safety as a female at work, in the home, is not important. So when there is no accountability, I think it leaves Australian women despairing.
Why does Peter Singer want to publish work that is so controversial that their authors can't put their names to it?
All right, well, this is in reference, Peter, to your new Journal of Controversial Ideas, which allows contributors to publish anonymously. Before I get you to explain that, Cameron, let me get your views on this. Do you think academics or other writers should be able to publish anonymously?
Look, I do. I mean, the Journal of Controversial Ideas, controversial ideas can cause trouble. I covered the invasion of the Capitol building in Washington earlier this year. I guess in a way that was a response to a controversial idea, which was Donald Trump's notion that he actually won the election. But
we got some of the pictures, in fact, of your day on that fateful day there at the Capitol. Some of the pictures you took of those who were involved in the insurrection.
Certainly, you know, that's the ultimate expression of the controversial idea where things went badly, but I don't think that the parallel is very good between that and what Peter is suggesting with the Journal, because Donald Trump's argument that he won the election, as far as I could tell, would never get published in your Journal, because I looked at the editorial requirements and you have to have a rational argument, it has to be well argued, and it has to not cause danger to society. And on those three bases, I think Donald Trump would fail. So I actually think, generally speaking, that it's a good idea to do this. I mean, I think public discourse, unfortunately, in recent years has become more fractious. You tend to have a bit more groupthink. You have social media pile-ons on minority opinions. And I can understand that an academic might fear for their own safety or even their own career if they want to put out ideas which are not popular. So I think I can understand where that comes from, but there's a big rider here, I think, Peter, and that is that it's hugely important that your editorial board, and there's about 55 of them as far as I can tell, make correct judgments on precisely what sort of controversial idea you want to publish, because I think there is a genuine difference between a controversial idea that might be unpopular, might even offend a few people, but is still worth putting out there in the marketplace of ideas, and as something which is just downright bigotry. And that's the line I think you have to draw. Do you publish a good, worthwhile article, or do you publish an article that might convince people to write on the Capitol building?
Well, Peter, if you're going to publish people under pseudonyms, what are the guardrails around that?
Well, it is an academic journal, which means that we send the papers out to peer review, as other academic journals do. And so we're sending them out to experts in the field, and they have to look at the argument and say, yes, there's some good argument here, or there's some evidence that is solid. Obviously, Donald Trump's claim that he won the election would not get to first base, didn't even get to first base with Republican officials in Georgia, for example, fortunately. Yeah. So, you know, that's not going to go there. What we really need are the strong arguments that, for one reason or another, and it can be from both sides of the political spectrum, people are going to be ideologically opposed to, and they might threaten the author, and that's certainly happened, you know, personal threats, death threats even that authors have had, or they might cause harm to the author's career, to particularly a junior academic who doesn't have a tenured position and needs to get one, and they might be worried that, you know, petitions may be written by other academics who oppose the idea, and they may then not be able to have an academic career at all. So that's why we're allowing people to publish under pseudonyms if they wish to do so. They don't have to.
Santilla, do you think it's a good idea?
No. Sorry, Peter.
Tell me why not.
Why? I think pseudonyms are useful if you fear reprisals, but I think, you know, and David and Cameron will probably know this, you know, when you work in journalism, sometimes even publishing the truth gets people, you know, causes a reaction, and people say things and people send threats and all that sort of stuff. But I certainly think that if you're going to have ideas, I think you should stand by them. It happens, you know, even in the arts. Like when you make work publicly, people will have opinions. People will be able to criticise these things, and to sort of hide behind the facade that, you know, you're potentially afraid that people might not necessarily understand what you're saying, or it might have implications for your career, is to sort of look at the world in a very different view, because I look at what I do for a living, and a lot of what I do is not controversial, but I still get people that feel a certain way, feel like they're entitled to, you know, send me racist comments, sexist comments, you know, and this is par for the course. I've accepted this is what it is. When I write work, when I create work publicly, people will have opinions. Sometimes people won't even engage with the work. You know, sometimes they'll just see the clickbaity headline and deduce from that whatever it is that they want to, and that's it. I've just accepted that that's what it is. So I think that if these academics feel that, you know, being able to debate these ideas, I feel like it's a bit of a cop-out, because I think that if you are going to be looking at these things and you want people to understand, and if the fear is that these ideas might be misinterpreted, then the question I'd be asking is, how do you raise the literacy of people to be able to actually understand these ideas that are being debated and discussed? And I think that's what I'd be more curious about, rather than sort of going, you know, hide behind a pseudonym, and therefore you can, you know, pursue controversial ideas. By the way, I find controversial to be a very weasel word.
Well, it can be, but I mean, you're clearly a strong and courageous person who's prepared to do that and prepared
well, it's not
to put
really
your face
about.
up there. But
I don't think it's about courageous. I think if you're a journalist, you either, you know, you.
Well, these are not journalists. These may be academics.
This is academia.
And they may have good ideas.
Yeah,
but they may be worried.
But they're still sharing these ideas publicly, right?
Yes.
And that is the risk that comes with it. Like I said, you know, when you are bringing things into the public square, people will have opinions.
Oh, sure, but should they have to risk their career in order to put out a worthwhile idea?
Should I have to risk my career to, you know, be getting racist comments and sexist comments for things that aren't even controversial?
It's your choice. If you want to do that, you can, but I don't think
it's a choice for an academic.
But exactly. So I just don't know. I just feel like it's a bit of a cop-out, honestly. Like, I understand what you're saying, and I don't disagree. I disagree to a certain extent, but I largely think that if you're going to be debating these ideas, I think you have to stand by them.
The thing is with ideas, it's not just what is said, it's who says it. And so in my academic world, we used to have round tables where we get people to put ideas on post-it notes and put them up on walls so that the idea could have ascendancy. Because sometimes the most junior person would have this amazing idea, but they would be nervous to say it with someone who had, you know, power over them or, you know, was more senior. And a senior person putting it up, we know over and over again in science, often the most senior people, you know, have this strong and powerful voice when actually what you want to do is democratise that academic intent. So I'm very much with Peter Singer about academia because it's about playing the idea and not the person.
What about social media?
When it comes to personal
should you be allowed to
commentary,
post on social media
and that's
anonymously?
where it comes to personal commentary. I disagree with that. I think people behind keyboard warriors, they're playing the person and not the ball. And so there is a difference. The academia, there's guardrails, there's an academic intent. That's different from personal commentary, and I think personal commentary should not be de-anonymised.
Okay, but then it sounds like it's more the bias that you're trying to curb then, less so.
So in academia, I think the issue is that there is the contest of ideas, and if you if you anonymise and de-identify that, then it allows those contests of ideas to become separated from the person who is saying them. And I spend a lot of time teaching my PhD students that discipline to be able to be objective about the idea and not be emotional.
My question's to the panel. Pork barrelling corrupts not just the people and wastes not just the money directly involved, but it corrupts the whole decision-making process of government. Thereby reducing its social licence and eroding its mandate to pursue other sort of areas of its agenda, such as health and medicine. My question is, how would you justify the spending of $660 million of public money on a car park slush fund developed with no due process and announced by the PM's office the day before caretaker conventions kicked in prior to the last election?
Katie, Alan, you might be relieved that the clock's ticking and we are running out of time here at the end of the program. But look, the Auditor General's report on this car park fund was a doozy. How do you justify it?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that, car parks, getting cars off the road, getting people on public transport, I actually back that in. And I also back in the fact that I don't think anyone's questioning that there is a need. So there is a need for those car parks.
Yeah, the problem here is that the Auditor General found this was demonstrably not merit-based.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, there's a large amount of infrastructure that was being spent, and some of it, I don't know, is that true that they said it's completely not merit-based?
Yes, said it was demonstrably not merit-based. The program was not effective. The decisions were not open and transparent. It's a damning report.
Right, well, I haven't read the specifics of the report. That definitely sounds damning, I have to say. But what I would say is that, my understanding is that there is infrastructure that needs to be built, and we want to make sure that infrastructure is being spent in the correct way. And it is true that the perceptions that people have about the way money is spent can undermine trust and integrity in the government, and that was in the previous parliament. But what I would say is that any possibility I have to get involved, it's to make sure that there is due and proper process, and I think we do need to do better in so many ways when we come to spending the taxpayers' money. But that being said, I understand that there was a number of weeks and months before that process, so I don't know if it was just an overnight decision.
Most of the projects were decided the day before the Prime
there was
Minister
$7 billion and $2 billion for the Melbourne Airport Rail and the Geelong Fast Train.
We're talking about this project.
Just
quickly, Peter Singer, just on this one, it's another example, I suppose, isn't it, of what elected governments think they can do, they can get away with. Should taxpayers at the very least expect merit-based spending?
Absolutely, they should. I think that's a clear ethical requirement. And it is very corrupting, in fact, because once one party does it when in office, then the others will say, well, we can do that too. It'll give us a political advantage. And the result is a downward spiral of public morality and public integrity. And I think it's really important for everyone to fight that. And I'm pleased to hear Katie saying that she's not going to support it, whether it's her political party or any other. I think I'd like to hear more members of Parliament taking that view.
On that note, we will leave it there. That's all we have time for. Would you please thank our panel, Santilla, Chingaipe, Katie Allen, Peter Singer, Cameron Stewart, and from Darwin, Malarndirri, McCarthy. And thank you all for your questions tonight. Next week, Virginia Trioli will be in the chair filling in, hosting live from Melbourne. I'll see you Sunday morning for a special 20th anniversary edition of Insiders. Good night.